From WHQR Public Media, this is The Newsroom. I'm Ben Schachtman. Thanks for joining us. Based in the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, Scene on Radio is an award-winning podcast series hosted by veteran reporter and producer John Biewen and has tackled some big issues: patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, and a deep dive on the 1898 Wilmington coup and massacre that we highlighted here on the show 2 years ago. For its most recent series, Scene on Radio is tackling a topic that has served as a through line in many of their past investigations: the news media. Biewen and co-host Chenjerai Kumanyika take a long, hard look at why people are upset with the news, exploring the economic, historical, political, and social aspects of the problem. The series is rooted in Biewen's boots-on-ground reporting in the border belt of North Carolina, and it features some familiar places and names, including our friends at the Border Belt Independent, who are still fighting to keep accountability journalism going in the face of financial challenges and growing news deserts. Kumanyika, an NYU journalism professor and podcaster, returns to the podcast for another outing. As with the series on whiteness, he joins Biewen to bring his own perspective and some provocative moments. Another name that comes up a lot in this series and on today's show is Penny Abernathy, who has a half-century of experience in journalism, starting at the Fayetteville Times and leading to senior executive roles at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Abernathy has also spent years as a researcher and author studying the problems faced by modern media, especially by local news outlets. My colleague Rachel Keith and I listened with great interest to the podcast earlier this summer, and we were excited that Biewen and Kumanyika were able to find the time to join us for this edition of The Newsroom.
So my opening question is, what pushed you to investigate this series? Was it something that bothered you too and thought we need to break this down for people, which is the news? John Biewen, why don't you start?
Well, so this comes on the heels of kind of series of series. As you know, we did seasons on white supremacy, on patriarchy, on democracy in America, and why we don't have more of it. A season on the climate crisis. We did a season on Wilmington 1898. And so I think there was a sense that, well, particularly in our democracy season, we had an episode working with Lewis Wallace on the role of the news media and journalism in the state of a democracy, right? It's so crucial that people have information if we're going to govern ourselves as a people. And there's this general sense of our news media being in crisis in a variety of ways that we can talk about, and I'm sure we will. And it doesn't hurt that Chenjerai and I love to work together, and Chenjerai happens to be a media scholar. So somehow, I don't remember exactly, Chenj, but somehow we came around to talking about doing a media season, and we finally did.
I mean, John really said it. On Scene on Radio, we look at things that are contributing to like major cultural conversations and crises that we're experiencing, and a lot of that is following John's curiosity. But I think what we try to do is bring history to that, right? And bring a lot more history and context. I think we look for opportunities where, there's a conversation happening that's right in front of everybody's faces, but there's a lot that when historically, that both history and reporting can reveal. And so we had been talking about media broadly, and my discipline is in media. So, and it does seem like media is, you think about social media and the way that our lives are so immersed to it. It's almost like, can we have a conversation with each other without it being a podcast? I'm almost like, we're at such peak podcast right now with media where it's like,
yeah.
But, it's clear people are misinformed. And so John really narrowed it to the news. And I think that with the news, we were like, this is one of those conversations where it's clearly directly involved, everything from you look at things like Pizzagate, but just to basic things that people, don't know, where there's a chance for us to bring history to that. I would also say it's also something that a lot of people think they know the answer to. Everybody has strong feelings about the media and thinks they know what's wrong. They have a take on it. The other thing that I thought was really sharp about John's decision to focus in on news was that it's implicated in all our other crises about the climate, about politics and race and gender, immigration. it's also its own crisis because we've literally seen our local news infrastructure in this country be almost completely destroyed. And so, yeah, for all those reasons, we're like, yeah, this is the one.
You also bring like an economic lens to this, which we appreciated as folks who know how the sausage gets made, on our annual budget. And I want to talk about the money. You sort of tracked the loss of advertising sales and that impact. Rachel and I were talking in the newsroom about the stats you cited from the Raleigh News and Observer. It just took both of our breaths away when we were listening to the show. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how this trend has kind of weakened newsrooms, whether that's coverage or institutional knowledge or legal support. How does that all play out in your view?
Well, it is shocking when you look at, and I think probably what you're alluding to is that the News and Observer, for example, had 300 to 350 journalists in their newsroom 25 years ago, and now they have maybe 1/10 that number.
Yeah.
And that's the same with the Charlotte Observer, and it's very typical across bigger daily newspapers. And then at the same time, and what we looked even more closely at is in places like southeastern North Carolina, the border belt where we spent a bunch of time, they had, solid local independent newspapers that may have three, four, five, six reporters up until the last decade or two. And now most of those newspapers have been sold off to chains, and they might have one person who is the manager and the editor, and they do almost no real local news, right? It's just they have somebody maybe who's covering high school sports, and they do a few light features, but they really are not doing the meat and potatoes of the journalism that any community would expect, what's happening with the city council and the school board and so on, right? So combine those things, the NNO would have also had reporters in those places so that you had layers of coverage and competition. And Penny Abernathy says at one point, the NNO boasted that it covered Eastern North Carolina like kudzu at one time. And now there's just literally no journalism being done in vast parts of the country and vast parts of the state. So yeah, so that's an economic story, but it's not as simple, I think, and this is something that Chenjerai kept kind of highlighting. It's too simple if you just say, well, the journalism industry went through a tough time. It's more interesting and kind of more sinister than that, because what happened was that when the news industry started to struggle in terms of the business model that it had been run on for a century with local advertising, classifieds went out the window with Craigslist and Facebook and so on. And then with the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, a whole bunch of local businesses that might have still been supporting the local newspaper with ads, they just flat went out of business, so that those ads went away. But then what happened is not just that business went through that struggle. It was that opportunistically a bunch of private equity firms and the like saw, oh, well, we can buy up these newspapers cheap, and we can get our money back relatively quickly because we can buy them cheaply, and we can run them in a different way, which is just as a kind of an investment opportunity like any other to make money in the short term, and then flip them or sell them again or whatever, just run them in this fashion with a kind of caretaker editor and manager at each paper that's not really doing a whole lot of journalism, but is still bringing in some revenue. And that's where we are today. And I think the depth of that has not been well communicated to the average person, and the ramifications of that collapse.
When we talk about money and news and sort of the market, I think that there's two ways people talk about it. And this series, I think, does kind of do a third thing, which is that you have a lot of people who are now, I think it's growing because of what people are living through, who are critical of capitalism, right? They're like, and they use the word capitalism, right? And that kind of stands in. But that's such a big, vast term for people to wrap their heads around what that actually means for newsrooms and for all these specific kinds of things that we're reporting on this series. And also there's a critique of billionaires, one which I'm fully aligned with. I would, love if everybody could all have billionaires on our plates for breakfast. But I think but that also, in the same way that there's probably people who hear me say that and react, it sort of diverts the question and starts to become about, are they bad people? And we're not talking about the sort of meat and potatoes of what's actually happening. The other side of the economic conversation is what you hear in various kinds of news and economic and finance channels that feels like it's in the weeds. It's like, oh, well, where's the market today? And this happened and jobs were lost and there's people got like, but it's so in the weeds and you sort of don't ever come out of it with a real understanding of like, there are actors here who had an agenda that was political and it was about making profit, but it was also about shaping things that was intentional and that has played out in a very clear way when you look at it right. So I think what John did with the reporting here and grounding it in North Carolina and in the career of someone like Penny Abernathy, right, who actually studies finance, right? She doesn't come just purely out of like lefty world. She's been in the newsroom. She's a consultant with the New York Times company. Like she's really, you can't question her. And she's saying, here's my account of what happened. And it's in North Carolina. I mean, I think that's a needed way that brings a critical analysis of the money, but does it in a way that's grounded and that's tangible to folks.
Going off of that, throughout the series, you touch on media models in other nations where the investment is much more robust than what we saw until recently for public radio and television in the U.S. I mean, do you think that the UK, Europe, Scandinavia, do they have a healthier ecosystem for journalists because the public more or less subsidizes the profession?
I mean, what I would say is yes. I think the U.S. is unique in how poor its public media is funded. I want to be clear that by saying that, it's not saying that Europe or anywhere that their media are not in these struggles. There's capital that's licking its chops, looking at the public media money there too. And and all my colleagues in media there are fighting those battles, but they're starting from a different place because there's a fundamental understanding that the media is an absolutely necessary public good. And I think that's also important because part of what we do in this series is if you sign up to listen to this series, you're going to listen to these 8 episodes and be forced to kind of like, invited. I don't want to say forced. No one's forced.
Yeah.
Invited to sit with the actual argument and the actual facts, something that's very hard to accomplish in the rest of our communicative environment. What happens is, and we talk about this in the series, as soon as you question the market and question capitalism, people immediately dismiss it and say there's no other alternative. So looking at the European and some of these other public media systems is a way to say, okay, if you want to think in those extremes, if your extremes are what we have now, the mess we have now, where there's literally no regulation on how much a person can own of the media, as John was saying earlier, Elon Musk could own every media thing. And at this point, the captured FCC says that's fine. Right, you have that extreme, and then people act like the only other possibility is like Stalinist. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's like black and white. Yeah,
right. No, I think these other models of public media show that actually, for a lot of history and in a lot of places, people have found a better balance, and it actually works.
So a little bit of a spoiler, but at the end of the show, you guys get into some detailed actual solutions, which we appreciate because the situation is grim. So having some light at the end of the tunnel was nice. One idea was a tax credit program. I was actually just in Canada and I got to talk to people about that program, which I think ran from 2020 to 2024. But it basically lets people get a tax credit to reimburse them in part for what they spend on qualified journalism. So we wanted to ask, seriously, do you think that's a pipe dream in the United States, given some pretty serious disagreements about what counts as qualified journalism? Or is this really something that we could do?
I don't see why it isn't something we could do. Yes, as we fully acknowledge, these sorts of things aren't going to happen in 2026 with the current administration that's in power and the current power structure in the Congress, right? But who knows what the politics of this country will be in 2027 or more likely 2029. And I do think one thing that I've come away with after spending a year and a half immersed in this subjects, I learned a lot about how much is going on out there, how many kind of organizations and nonprofits and are thinking deeply about these things. No, we're 4 steps ahead of where I was when I started looking at this in terms of understanding the problem. For example, the Media Power Collaborative, which we just give a mention to, that is tracking and paying attention to initiatives in, I think it's more than 20 states now, where they have at least proposals and then legislatures, and in some cases, legislatures have passed laws to provide public support for journalism in one way or another, including kind of helping to shore up local newsrooms, these sorts of things. So I do think that it's a conversation that's in this fairly early stages, but that could really pick up steam. And if we have the other sorts of changes that you could imagine if the pendulum swings in this country politically in the direction of actually government doing more to help us all have more good things and to support people and to support communities, that this could be part of that conversation about how we could shore up the news media. Because to go back to your previous question, if you look at the BBC or Deutsche Welle, or I lived in Japan for decades ago, and the place that the NHK plays, that's their kind of BBC equivalent, radio and television in that society. It's not like it's not the panacea or like, okay, that solves everything. But there is absolutely, I think, a case to be made that because they have a well-funded, in that case, public broadcasting system that sort of occupies a more central place in the discourse in that country, that it actually does make a difference in the quality of the conversation than what we have in our complete sort of Wild West system that we have here, completely for-profit dominated.
One reason why it was really important for us to take some time and lay out some of these ideas is that we're not actually in a crisis of ideas. And so often people try to make it seem like there's no other, the ideas aren't there. And that's really a diss to the people who have, in some cases, dedicated their lives to implementing these at a smaller scale, innovating them, thinking about them, fighting for them. What we have is a political power problem. And, look, I live in New York. And if you had told me a couple of years ago, universal childcare or 2K, or even 3K, honestly, 10 years ago, if you had said that could be a reality in New York, I would have been, a lot of people would have been like, that's a pipe dream. And yet my daughter went through 3K in New York. You know what I'm saying? And this year it's going to open up. 2K is going to open up. If you had said, we're going to pass a law where people are charged a lot of money, a significant amount to come through the Holland Tunnel because we got too many cars, and we're going to use that to make our public transportation more robust, it would have seemed like a pipe dream. And when people fought it, people act like it was the apocalypse. Then guess what? It got implemented, and it's great. This is about power. It's about building political power. And, Penny Abernathy at one point in the series, to come back to Penny, is something I just noticed recently when I was listening back. She said, I started to realize that the war about journalism wasn't going to be won by good journalism. She didn't just mean that it's the bad journalism is going to win in terms of content. What she realized and what governs the way that she moves is that she said our battles are beyond just whether somebody's reporting harder. It's about politics. It's about money. It's important to lay the ideas out, though, so that you can see that they're there. But ultimately, these are political power problems.
We're exploring, and it would be nice to actually have conversations about shoring up that system, that public system. But it sounds like we've got for-profit or we've got nonprofit. So, and that's the world we live in. I mean, we are 100% community funded now here at WHQR. It looks like the Border Belt Independent that you focused on in your series.
And shout out to the community that's funding that. What I mean? Look, money is real. We it takes an effort and commitment and obligation to say, what, let me make sure I chip in so we all have this. But that's why I still love people.
Yeah. And, Democracy Now!, that's nationally, philanthropically funded. Are there other newsrooms that you'd like to highlight that are doing, that looks like the route now is for the community to basically come in and say that this is important, or local businesses?
Oh my gosh, there are so many. I mean, some that we mentioned that people will have heard of nationally. ProPublica, Chenj, help me out. The Intercept.
The Intercept. But what was the name of the publication in North Carolina that does a thing where they offer it for free so that they don't have people?
Oh yeah, NC Local.
Ads. NC Local.
Yeah, we host their stuff pretty often.
And that was, and the Border Belt Independent, you might have been thinking, because that was exactly the one that,
Border Belt. And I think, and also, here in New York, we have Documented. And that's the tricky thing that we tried to illustrate, is that when you understand the scale of the damage that's happened to journalism, what you understand is that these sort of projects of survival are not by themselves enough. We're going to need a real bigger political solution. But that is in no way, we got to shout out the people that are doing good journalism under these conditions, continuing to work, continuing to report the truth when there's like direct political consequences also for reporting the truth, in addition to the fact that, you don't have probably the resources. So we always want to shout those out and lift those up.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that for sure. But shifting gears a little bit, could you talk to us about what you found with journalists bias versus accuracy. I mean, is one valued to you all more than the other? And I really heard the farmer that you interviewed from the border belt, and he saw the media as putting a spin on stories, which we hear commonly. And they're not just telling the facts. Like, we just want to hear the facts. But throughout your series, these people sometimes just seek out biased people or journalists or comms people from the parties, political parties who represent a particular point of view. So they're seeking those people out, is what I heard.
There's just so many layers to this bias question, right? So, and we start out in the series sort of acknowledging the fact that, especially in a, sort of bitterly divided country, that there's a human tendency to want to sort of have your pre-existing beliefs reinforced. I experienced that personally, right?
Right.
And to sort of get some comfort, especially in a time when you're outraged every day, to sort of look for hope or to look for somebody who's telling what you think you want to hear about the way the world is. And that goes across the political spectrum. But then also, and the sharper that sort of divide gets, the more people have gotten sort of into their camps where and we have this increasing sort of this notion that, well, those people over there, don't trust them. You can't believe them. And that's certainly been a change. We talk about this 60-year drumbeat going back to the Nixon administration, at least, from the right wing saying to people on the to Republicans or to conservative folks, don't trust the mainstream media. They are illegitimate. They're biased. They're outside the mainstream. And that has taken on a different level of kind of intensity and urgency under Trump where you have a president who isn't just kind of complaining from time to time, but is absolutely, but just throws out constantly language like the fake news when he's talking about the mainstream media.
Or the enemy of the people.
The enemy of the
Yeah,
people, right? So actually, absolutely encouraging half the country to completely tune out the most kind of professional and rigorous journalism that's being done in the country, or at least a lot of it that comes from the legacy media. You talked about with the distinction between unbiased journalism. What we end up kind of exploring is what does that mean really? What do people mean when they say that? And oftentimes the misunderstanding, and I think nobody has this misunderstanding more than a whole bunch of people who work in mainstream media, is that what it means to strive for being unbiased or neutral is to sort of aim down the middle between what one side is saying and the other side is saying, or to sort of put out there what people are saying and then throw up your hands and say, who knows what's true? And that's just not good journalism. That's not what it should mean to be quote unquote objective. Jen, you want to elaborate on that?
John said it. I mean, I think, it's a frustrating conversation, to be honest with you, because it's I think we know, I teach journalism. A lot of students come in thinking that no journalist has ever thought about this before. They're like, the problem is, my students think that the problem actually is that all journalists think they're supposed to be objective. Like they're looking at the problems that happen with that sort of confusing sort of neutrality with objectivity. Because, and I'm like, no, this is actually one of the most discussed things. And I understand why, there's another set of students and also people who are like, look, I want the facts. And I think they understand that, like, it does take a kind of discipline to seek out and confront facts which actually challenge the thing that you already think. And so I think that people wanting that is not wrong. The problem is that it's been underwritten, as John was saying, by this lie, and the lie is that actually the neutral place or the middle place is always the smartest place, when sometimes that's not true. Sometimes an ICE agent shot a person, and that's the facts. If you report all the objective facts, what you're going to get is that this was like a federal authoritarian killing, and that's what the facts are. So someone saying that sentence, even though it may not point in a way that you like politically, that didn't mean it was biased. It meant that that's what the facts were in that particular case. So I think, and I think that what worries me as someone who's a journalism educator is that so much of the reporting that's responsible for the rights we have in this country required journalists to take positions that were at times risky and to conclude things and research things that sometimes reflected very poorly on people in power. And they definitely arrived at conclusions. They didn't just say, here's the facts, and I kind of don't know what it thinks, and it's one way or the other. It's messy. It's like, you look at this robust tradition of journalism that promoted democracy. It wasn't about, it's messy. Sometimes it is messy, but it was about, no, it was like Watergate. This was, this was corruption. Or all the reporting in the civil rights movement. Like, another thing that I just should say that we explore is that this idea that this is some recent problem because of the woke left, but somehow our founding fathers were in this tradition of neutral journalism is completely ahistorical in ways that I didn't even understand until we really started to report on this. So, yeah, I mean, I think that we want to make sure that journalists are steeped in the best traditions of journalism that are also the best for democracy.
I had a professor back in the late 90s who told me the job is not to give 6 minutes to the Jews and 6 minutes to the Nazis.
Agreed.
Well said.
There it is.
This was back before Facebook, or really the internet the way we know it now. But even then, people would always say, I just want Cronkite back. And somehow people managed to forget that Cronkite came back from Vietnam and said, hey, we can't win this war. That's not unopinionated.
The moment he's best known for. Yeah, exactly.
So I want to ask about a different kind of bias. And I think we're probably guilty of this here at HQR, maybe in a lot of other newsrooms, but that's a bias for criticism over praise. We hear from a lot of people that we don't do quote-unquote good stories. And we also hear the criticism of so-called gotcha journalism, which Rachel and I have talked about this. We're not entirely sure how we would define gotcha journalism. It just seems to be anytime we write anything damning about anyone in power.
I mean, yeah, that's tricky. I think, when people ask and say you're not doing enough of that, it's interesting to think about what's at work. I mean, I'm curious to hear what John says. My feeling on it is that it's good for us to think about, how our reporting, we might be focusing too much on trying to take people down, or just thinking, for example, how we need to care for our listeners by also providing moments of hope and of the fullness of life. Like, I think those are good things to think about. But when I think about this problem, what I think about is the larger business forces and how they structure and heighten that dynamic in a way because of algorithms and because of what, clickbait and all these other things. So one of the results, for example, of the process we've talked about, where you get, at one point, at least in some expressions, advertising and this hunger for data and all those things governing the news environment. And you get, certain kinds of institutions who primarily see themselves as entertainment governing news, is that they just want what leads. And so I think this particular capitalism, I think, has a bias toward negative news. That's what I think we have to really grapple with, so that it's not simply the fact that journalists are only reporting on that, because there are people out there who are doing the positive news and talking about this and this and that. The question is that going to get in front of your eyeballs in your algorithm, or is it going to be the other thing that makes somebody else a lot of money?
Yeah, when I hear the phrase gotcha journalism in that sense, I hope you're not just doing gotcha journalism. It sounds like, it evokes an image of a journalist who just, like, for the sake of a scoop, is out trying to catch somebody out at something, right? So I get that criticism, but there's also, of course, one of the greatest traditions of journalism is the watchdog, right? It is being on the lookout for all forms of corruption or abuses of power, whether it's in government or business or whatever. And that's absolutely an important part of the work that we should be doing. So I think so long as you're doing that in a spirit of making life better in the community, then that's absolutely noble work to do. And I think I'd do a lot of journalism that is essentially pointing out stuff that's wrong. But in the same spirit, I do think that's really important work. I think I've actually tried to get better in the later part of my so-called career at giving hope in the form of not only here's what's screwed up about the world or under this particular topic, but here are some great things that people are doing, and here are some ways of thinking about how to move forward and to make things better, which I do think is important to do that sort of journalism too.
I also want to say, I think people are starting to see through gotcha journalism. If you look, for example, what's going on with the current rate, as the process of the midterm elections play out, what you're seeing, right, is that a lot of these forms of gotcha journalism are baked in to our, the very dynamic people are worried about, are baked into major news outlets. So how many times have I seen a progressive candidate whose platform is primarily about like affordability and all these other issues, and the first thing they have to answer is, do you condemn Hamas? What do you think about years ago? Half the time it's not even them. Sometimes in the case of someone like Francesca Hong, she's reflected critically on police, which is absolutely necessary and reasonable. By the way, when you're in a state where Corey Ruiz Jr. just got popped in the head 3 times and ISIS is killing people on the street, in that context, it's reasonable for people to ask critical questions about the police. But that said, sometimes it's not even it's literally like I come on as a progressive candidate in one state and they're like, this other DSA candidate said this about police. What do you think? It's like people are starting to realize like, yo, what are you doing? Can we talk about my platform? Can we talk about the major issues? And by the way, can we get a conversation about our news media? Like people are starting to see through that kind of those gotcha things that are built into our main things, I think are starting to lose grip in some ways.
And I mean, I think is this fair? Is this a fair question? It's a difficult question. And I feel sometimes those difficult questions can feel like gotchas, but I feel that the public deserves to know where you are on this. And they might feel, pressure. It is pressure. They do have a large platform. They want to represent all these people. I'm hoping that they won't feel offended by something that's hard to talk about or where they stand on the issue. But
I just want to say I love that distinction you're making because it is confusing. And I think everybody here has been speaking to this, which is that there's gotcha journalism and then there's something that feels like a gotcha because maybe you're seeing someone be asked something that is uncomfortable. But just because it feels that way, that's okay that it feels funny, but that doesn't make it gotcha journalism. Now we got to ask some deeper questions. So maybe part of what this is about, and I think what this series is about, is recognizing that people have understandable questions or anxieties, but how can we deepen those with better questions?
You both we're talking about this, and Ben and I live this, about declining faith in the Fourth Estate, the news media as an institution, and then polls we know show that. We know that local journalism does a little better than national. But in our experience, we feel that there's been a decline in respect. I mean, governments are balking at simple interview requests or public records requests that have been standard issue, just a generation ago. We've had candidates, unfortunately, I mean, it's the truth, mainly Republicans, they're skipping forums. They decline to answer questions. And again, I see that for governments. It's not just one political side or the other. But do you have any takeaways about that part of the story?
I guess I just see that mainly in the context of what we were talking about before, about the drumbeat of the news media being illegitimate, being biased, being the enemy. And that has been particularly pervasive from the right. And so, yeah, I think that's right. And I just notice when I read, for example, I read the New York Times and I see increasingly that there will be some fairly straightforward bit of journalism that they're doing about what some government department is up to. And they'll just say in the article that, that we got no response from the Department of X or Y to this, that this government entity puts out a statement that calls them biased and says, yeah, you in the fake news would ask a stupid question like this, this sort of thing. And it's just part of what I think is frankly a bad faith process of sort of working the refs and trying to delegitimize the news media. And it's working very well with a substantial part of the population in the country. Maybe 30% of us now are just say, yeah, forget it. La 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 la.
I'm really worried about it because I think in a larger sense, I think what it really is like a breakdown in the idea of dialogue. And I think that what we really need is a breakdown in the idea that politicians even need to be accountable and those kinds of things. And I think that part of what we need and why we need local, robust journalism and independent institutions that are accountable to people is because without that, you get on the one hand, right, politicians who kind of are like, look, I got my people and my little sort of like really just almost like PR channels. I wouldn't even call it journalism. And we actually don't even have to answer you because we think we can actually get elected and govern without really ever answering or being accountable to you in a meaningful way. So that's deeply serious crisis of democracy there.
Yeah.
But the other thing you have is like you have moments where like people are saying, I'm not going to show up to even the debate. And that's more complicated because the debates are kind of like
Mm.
a meaningless political theater. Who at this point feels like a real debate is really where things are getting decided, or you know what I'm saying? There's a weird way where when people ignore the debate or Trump decides, I'm not even gonna go to your debate, it's worrisome, but it's also like people are like, yeah, because the debate was a theater. You know what I mean? You're
Yeah.
already signing up for some. So this is why we need we need something better.
Yeah, and we hear commonly, you know what, I'm going to take my points directly to the people. Like, I don't need to have you as an intermediary. And I mean, even in Morning Edition, if you listen on NPR, a lot of times they'll say the invitation is still open, because then they'll say NPR's biased because all they have is Democratic congressmen or congresspeople, on the air, but they always say the invite's open. I think they're trying to get differing points of view, but they're just not accepting the invitation.
I mean, one thing I'll say, I don't know what you all are seeing, and what your experience is. I'm curious, but I think what I've concluded is that people want to trust and have a relationship with the person they're getting news from. And I
Yes.
think in a weird way, this is why social media is kind of taken off, because even me, right? Like I try to read the papers and support the, institutions of journalism, which are doing the real reporting and have the capacity that like an influencer is never going to have. But there are some people who get news quick, and I've learned to see like, oh, I feel like this person pretty much he's pretty much factual, and I pay attention to him. You know what I mean? I subscribe.
Yeah.
So, so I don't know what your experience of that is locally, because I feel like those kinds of folks, I think, in a way, are empowered to say, hey, y'all trust me. The larger consensus on this is wrong.
And that person is often going to come pretty immediately with a kind of analysis, or a kind of, here's why this is important and here's what sense I make of it. And if that's someone who you trust to provide that sort of analysis, then yeah, you can go back to that person. And that's often missing in the initial news report.
Did you all look in your reporting for this series? Did you look into the rise of government public relations or government communications departments? I mean, in the book, I read this a couple of years ago, Elements of Journalism, written by Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenthal, if I'm saying that right. They last edited that edition in 2021. They wrote, quote, an analysis of Central Bureau data found that the ratio of public relations workers to journalists grew from 1.2 to 1 in 1980 to the point in which 2018 that public relations professionals outnumbered journalists 6-1. And I don't even know what the current ratio is, but I mean, I'm sure it's gone up. But how has this impacted journalism in your view?
I've looked at that mostly in relation to some of my own work on police. I made a podcast called Empire City about the history of the NYPD. The NYPD had 86 PR people working for them at one point. And, my friend Alec Karakatsanis has talked about the just, ultimately thousands of PR people just working for the police, as that just want that part of government. So what happens is that if you're a journalist in a local newsroom and you want stories, they have a whole apparatus ready to hit you with their thing. And because of time or whatever and your need for sources, you're kind of vulnerable to that. Meanwhile, these are people who are paid to support the narratives that the police want out there. So that's a real problem if that's that journalistic pipeline. That's just one small example.
Yeah, on the one hand, I think the fact that there is so much that corporations and government entities are expanding their PR departments dramatically, that's evidence that actually they do care what the news media has to say. And secondly, yeah, I think I would probably, on the other hand, I would maybe put a little more emphasis on the other side of that equation, the fact that we've just lost so many journalists, and that's why that's a major reason that ratio has swung so dramatically.
I think part and parcel of this too is, and we could probably do a whole other podcast on this, the sort of McKinsey-ification of government. You talk about consultants. I mean, it's a very corporate communication model. And I feel like that, at least for us locally, has changed quite a bit over the last 10 years. I mean, with police, there was always a little bit more guardedness. But when it came to the city, if you were talking about a big contentious rezoning, you could talk to someone in the planning department and talk about what they were weighing stuff. If it was about, critical infrastructure, clean water not getting to low-income neighborhoods, you could talk to someone at the water utility about what it actually meant to put in a 40-inch pipe versus a 50-inch pipe or something like that. And now, at best, you sort of get statements handed up from the subject matter experts through the comms department. And at worst, the comms department just kind of guesses. And all of this, I feel like, has really deracinated our ability to like be accurate and have meaningful conversations with the people in government who are doing the actual work of government.
I think it's really important for you to share. I think when you give that account of like having lived through this change, there was a time when you could talk to a politician. And of course, politicians always had agendas. They always want to spin things in their favor, but there was a sense that you could get like have something like a real conversation as opposed to like these straight up, these consultant talking points that are coming down from people and everybody. You already know from the gate when you come up, they're just going to hit you with the talking points, and it's almost like you might as well just talk to ChatGPT at this point. It's
Yes.
like, having lived through it, I mean that this particular aspect is not as much as the focus of our series, but I do think it's important. But one thing our series does is show how in the not too distant past, things were very different. And that means they can be different going forward. Because what happens when the cynicism and we started talking about where things are is that people get demoralized and they feel like, there's nothing we can do. And it's like, wait. There's no way that this could have been different in our lifetime, but you telling me there's nothing we can do now.
Yeah, and also, just like government, having a real conversation with someone who works in a governmental department or something, a bureaucrat who's actually doing the work, and
Yeah.
it's just hard to have that conversation anymore. Yeah, that's
Yes.
not a good trend.
But I would say also, one component of it though is y'all tell me what you think. But to me, what a robust journalistic organization with multiple employees and some resources does is it actually makes you less reliant on what those people say, whatever they're saying, right? It's like the whole thing is it shouldn't just be you got a source in government, whether he's being guided by McKinsey. It should be that he's going to say his thing, McKinsey or not, and then you can go research and say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? Because you have the time. I'm going to do this. Whereas if you're one person, the thing that has made people so vulnerable to those local versions of that and things like the White House press corps, I don't even like the term lazy. People might call journalists lazy, but I'm like, an overworked journalist who's trying to get the story out on time and has to rely inordinately on a source who's going to give them some BS. That's not a lazy journalist. That's a journalist working in a newsroom that doesn't have the resources it needs.
Yeah. And I mean, Dr. Kumanyika, you talked about at the end of the series, like journalists more or less have a responsibility to democracy and the truth. And I read this book a couple years ago, but this point stuck out to me from Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny. He talked about in Poland to overcome resistance to communism, but it was basically an autocratic government. In 1976, he wrote, quote, "Intellectuals and professionals formed a group to assist workers who had been abused by the government. These people were from both the right and the left, and believers and atheists who created trust among workers. Later, when these people went on strike again in 1980, they were joined by lawyers, scholars, and other people who helped them make their case." And then we know that later in the 1980s, the Polish eventually ended this communist and more or less autocratic stronghold. In this scenario, what role would journalists play? Would they just be there to document and understand all the different perspectives, or would they play a more active role in the truth of what was happening at the time?
I get that people want journalists to have some degree of autonomy and distance from certain aspects of the political world. That makes sense as a fundamental thing. You don't want to be totally embedded. But I think at this point, there comes a point when the crisis and attack on democracy and on the basic institution of journalism in a democracy is so acute that you got to get involved. So one area I would ask to, I know John has some examples. One area I would say you should look to is the labor organizations in journalism, because some of this can be reined in simply if workers can have a more governance power in their workplaces. And there's a lot of labor organizations who are leading the way. If you look at some of the major crises and the things that are going on, you can look at some of those labor organizations of journalists and they are leading the way. Now, that's one thing that's important. I would also say we do have to look at the political platforms of candidates, certain aspects of policy, for example, around the FCC and around these regulations about ownership and all those things. Those are things where I'm sorry, but I think journalists have to get in and say what they think. And if you get accused of being partisan, it's whatever. But we're literally, I mean, the reality is those things will also affect journalists who think very differently than you, report, across the political spectrum. It's going to affect everybody. So I think we got to get in those fights in political in a way. I don't think reporting is going to be enough. Was Penny Abernathy's point. Good journalism is crucial. It has to continue. But it's not going to be enough if other people are doing bad journalism and they're also doing all the other, power authoritarian moves.
Yeah, I want to drill down on it a little bit, Dr. Kumanyika, because one of the most provocative things I heard in all 8 episodes, maybe, and I want to quote at length because I want to get the context in here. You said, journalists don't get a pass on organizing and participating in movements unless we expect everybody else to fight for our most important institutions while we kick back and write and hold mics and cameras and just describe shit, right? I mean, we're at a point where we have to fight to keep our microphones and to keep the channels of communication open. And actually, a crucial piece of this is the only way we can win is if we can merge or join with the power of other movements, with millions of people who have stakes in this fight, but who can also bring legal power, policy power, political power in many places, who can register voters, protest, create media pressure, strike, and shut shit down. And then when they ask what we want, news media has to be right there on the list with everything else. So that's going to seem, at least to some journalists, as a little antithetical to the prescription against getting political by journalists. So what I want to ask is, are there limits to that, to the kinds of groups you would align with? And I mean, candidly, do you see any potential issues with that suggestion?
I absolutely do. I think I'll say this. I mean, that's my words. I stand by them. But there's nothing about that process that's going to be easy. What I'm talking about is coalition. Because as I said before, what we have is a political power problem, which means we also have a leverage problem. We need a big enough tent of people who can say, hey, wait a minute, I'm sorry, but this is a little too far. Just on some basic stuff. I want to be crystal clear. We're talking about low-hanging fruit here, people. We're talking about, can we have public media funded at the most basic levels? Can we stop the FCC from just cracking down on journalists because they said something about the president? Can we, have the basic things we need? Like that, none of those are, to me, those things are popular, actually, when you talk to people individually across political lines. So just to be clear there, but the only way you can force it in or bring it in is with coalition. Now, coalition building is messy, and I think journalists have to retain, actually, to say, there's absolutely should be a moment when, look, maybe there's a political group who has a lot of influence, could be teachers, could be, some part of labor, and they're like, join with us, journalists, in this, and maybe the journalists are like, you know what, I can walk down the road here, but I got to stop here because of my autonomy. That's good, but journalists are not going to do it as a sector alone. And honestly, I'm in the American Association of University Professors. Higher education isn't going to do it alone. We all have to come together and say, what are the things we share, right, and fight. And I think that it's possible to weed through. So I agree. I really received this provocation because, it could look like I'm just saying, journalists just go join with the social justice movement and go all the way, whatever the thing is. And I'm like, nah, but what I'm saying is you don't have to do that. But here's the question you got to ask. What is the political force that you're going to wield against one of the most powerful authoritarian regimes that we've seen in this country's history right now?
And I mean, I will go to bat for anybody on the political spectrum if it's about public records or if it's about...
Public records is a great example.
Yes, yeah. Or
freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech.
First Amendment.
First Amendment. We're going to be in the same boat, all of us. Same thing with... They deserve an answer. I don't care who it's coming from. You can't just ignore them. They deserve to know. Don't hide. And that's from anybody. Just answer the question or provide the record.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, it won't be hard for people to figure out where I fall on the political spectrum. But if somebody in the political party I tend to vote for does something that's absolutely wrong and against the people, which, by the way, happens all the time.
Oh, yes, yeah.
I want that person to be held accountable. And if you are in another party and you also want that person to be held accountable because fundamentally what's being challenged is democracy, then we have a common issue.
Yeah, corruption, for example, right? You protect the public's money, you protect the public interest.
Yeah.
There you go.
I really enjoyed that you touched on this because it's obviously something every journalist in every newsroom has been talking about since time immemorial. It's like, describing where the boundaries are. And I think you put some more meat on the bone there about if it's impacting lowercase d democracy, if it's impacting people's ability to know what their government is doing, all the work of the fourth estate, like that's a thing that you can get active about. I mean, we talk in the newsroom about transparency is like one of the few things journalists can have an unabashed and very vocal opinion about, because I think that serves the people. I think what we worry about a little bit is journalists who then lose themselves when they wander off the path too far, and then they become advocates, and then no one takes them, no matter how good their journalism is, because they are staking out political positions, they then get kind of the cold shoulder from people who could really benefit from the work they're doing.
It's 100% a absolute legitimate concern. I agree.
Yeah. A few things come to mind. One, we had this moment where Pete Hegseth and the Pentagon started putting these onerous requirements on journalists covering the Pentagon that you had to basically sign up to. They had to let them sign off on anything you reported, whether I mean, it was ridiculous. And almost the entire legacy news media, including Fox News, walked out and said, So, okay, that's a nice example, right? Of not pretending that you don't have a position to defend when it's something directly related to the work you're actually doing and to the First Amendment, which we should all feel just fine about being on the side of the First Amendment and freedom of the press, right? On the other hand, a couple other examples. So I was dismayed by the silence of most of the mainstream news media in this country over the deaths of how many hundred journalists in Gaza. They're just sort of reporting it dutifully. And there should have been, I think that would have been appropriate for there to be some expressions of real outrage about that, aside from the deaths of tens of thousands of other people in Gaza, but certainly in that the fact that
which included Israeli journalists, by the way.
Yeah, the fact that the Israeli government seemed to be significant evidence that they were actually targeting journalists certainly people who they knew were journalists. There should have been more screaming and yelling about that. Yeah, and I think in general, the arrest of Georgia Fort and Don Lemon, these sorts of the journalists are under attack in ways that we are not used to seeing. And I think that in that context, journalists should absolutely feel free to defend the work of other journalists and of our profession. And that's, I think, really what Chenjerai is talking about there.
And I mean, we know this context. And you've seen it as a slow trickle. Even I got into journalism in 2017. But a couple of years ago, I was asking myself, what am I supposed to be doing? What are my values? And that's what led me back to the elements of journalism, which I've found very helpful. Our first allegiance is to the truth. The second allegiance is to the citizens. Our job is to monitor power and verify information. It was helpful. What am I supposed to be doing? I'm supposed to be doing that. But according to both of you, I mean, a budding journalist, what is this person supposed to be doing? What values should they be holding?
First of all, thank you for quoting all that. I got to play this for my students. See, it's not just in class. Here's a real live journalist in the wild quoting elements of journalism.
I am in the wild.
Reading, actually reading and quoting and thinking about the things that I will assign to my students. Yeah, John, what do you think? You're the real reporter here, bro. I'm just a podcaster who goes on rants. It's different.
Yeah, right. So what should journalists be up to? And we talk about it, and I've been looking for a chance to bring this up because we were talking earlier about in the face of an authoritarian government of a sort that we have not seen, arguably ever in American history. And we talk about the time of the American Revolution, 1770s, that journalists didn't think it was their job to be neutral for the most part. They tended to take a side. Are you a loyalist newspaper, or are you a newspaper that's on the side of not necessarily revolution right away, but of speaking bluntly about what were widely seen as abuses and mistreatment by the British Crown?
Enough of this anti-British nonsense. I can't stomach it. 6 minutes to the British.
There we go.
Yes, exactly. Right. So the idea that that they should have been neutral. So there was there's no more treasured moment, I think, to most Americans than the revolution itself that created this country, right? And we complicate that actually in one other season of Scene on Radio. But nonetheless, aside
Bracketing
from
that.
bracketing that, that highlights the idea that the fact that this is a relatively recent posture that mainstream media has adopted, and it's a posture grounded in a business model. This posture of, oh, we're kind of standing above it all. We don't have a dog in the fight. We're going to put some facts out there and let's folks make sense of it. And yes, you should be rigorous. Yes, you should be willing to follow the facts where they lead, but it's also legitimate to have principles and decide that if something is absolutely goes against what we think of as our shared principles, in this case, democracy and freedom, then you don't have to pretend to be neutral about that or to both sides that issue. That's really all we're saying. And I
Yeah,
think journalists, I think that's an important lesson for young journalists.
in addition to what John said, which is right on the money, is like, and things that I know you already know because of the incredible work you're doing. I mean, on one sense, there's the basic things that journalists have to do, which is like you be a watchdog, right? Report. Verification, I think, is crucial right now because at a time when you can't even trust the images in front of your face, it's crucial. For me, it's key that journalism is one of the key places where we should have a discipline of verification and a set of methods to say, this is how you figure out what's true. I mean, if that process is so complicated right now because of AI and so forth, but like those basic things, be a watchdog on power, verify, report, right? Organize information into an account of this deals with chronology, what happened before what, basic things, search public records, go out and talk to people who disagree. But I think that in this environment, it's confusing for journalists because in the face of the attacks that we were talking about and that John was describing, it feels like that's not enough. So what I would also just add is what we talk about in the end of the series, which is that as a group and as a sort of sector of society, journalism has to be involved in surviving. For you as an individual journalist, that means you got to survive your workplace, which means you sometimes got to, you can't always do maybe the most bold thing at that moment. And the whole idea of organizing and moving collectively is that we don't want everybody to run out there and sort of catch a grenade and lose their, lose their jobs. That's not helping us. But we do have to survive. So that's one. We got to imagine something new. And then we have to build the kind of power to fight for these basic things. Like you were given, you were given the example with Hegseth. This is prior restraint, the most basic principles of American journalism. So now, so the question I think that each individual journalist would ask is, maybe not in your job as a journalist, but even outside of your job, are you involved in efforts that are involved in those things? Because even at a psychological level, it's probably going to make you feel better if you know. And I know lots of people who are like, look, this is what I got to do in my job, because this is the conditions of my workplace. But here's what I'm doing outside of that to try to address the fact that we got to have a longer horizon than me surviving every day.
I would be remiss if I did not ask this, and we're struggling with it, and it's the big question. I bet you know it's coming, but AI in journalism. I did go to a journalism conference and see local news. I go to it every year. It's really good. But there was a Duke University professor, Tyler Dukes. He was there. He is now at University of Florida, and he basically gave talk about you don't need AI to write for you, okay? You need AI to maybe come up with some creative tools to find information or collect information. You're going to have to vet that information, but that was my big takeaway from listening to him. Is that where you all are on that issue? We haven't really adopted a good way to move forward. We're thinking about it, but that takes a lot of resources to even train the model for fact-finding or pulling records or things like of that nature.
I'll let John, I'm gonna let you have the last wise word on this. I'll just say, I don't think you need AI for anything. No one needs well, it means not no one, maybe somebody's doing some protein folding and, they can really, like, but so that's one. I think the first thing is that we have to deal with the fact that AI has being forced on us by a set of actors who are going to benefit from it. And I think that's one thing you have to understand. Like suddenly there's all these people like, it's inevitable and you got to get in the mix and it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. So I just want to first understand that's the water we're swimming in. The second thing is that I think, and what we should be talking about is things like data centers and the incredible computing power and resource draining things that all of this is requiring. Like those are some things we should be talking about. And not just like how wonderful AI and look at the new innovation and the way it can help you. I would say part of being forced on us is that this is being forced on us at a point when these tools actually aren't that good. And
That
so
was
if
my
you
takeaway.
so if you use it, it's a weird thing. Like, look, I've used some of these things, and what I find is that after those things, they make mistakes, they hallucinate, and if you know they hallucinate, then guess what? That means you got to fact check the thing that was supposed to make the job easier. So I actually think in a weird way, sometimes it makes more work, and that's crucial because you don't want to be the journalist. We've seen them. You probably every one of us might even know a colleague who has put something out into the world that was hallucinated, and you don't want to be the face of the newsroom that does that. So I think at this phase, maybe 10 years down, 20 years down the line, when they figure this stuff out, it's different. But right now, I think we have to really have a critical eye and stick to the fundamentals of journalism. And that's not to judge people who might be using this for survival. And I think we should even push back, because part of what's going to happen in newsrooms is these tools are here. They tell you they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And then next thing you know, they expect you to do more work as a result of it. We got to push back on all that.
So I don't know if you got to the end of the credits of the last episode, but
Yeah,
I
the disclaimer.
included a disclaimer that
Yeah.
I'm going to read it here. No generative AI was used in the research, writing, production, or any other facet of this project. It probably is a little bit easier for me as someone who is much, much closer to the end of my so-called career than the beginning to sort of say, okay, I've been doing this for more than 40 years without AI. I'm not going to start using AI now. If I were your age, if I were 30 years younger, I'd probably be struggling more with that question. And broadly speaking, what you quoted Tyler Dukes as saying, I think that's reasonable. Like, okay, if this is a tool that maybe helps you kind of aggregate some sources or kind of some roads to go down in your reporting, I can imagine that it might be a useful tool in that regard. But the other anecdote I would share, and it's related to this. So NC Local, they interviewed me for their newsletter, and I had heard it came out, but I couldn't find it. So I Googled, and I just put in the Google search, I put my name and NC Local to see would it spit out this newsletter, publication that featured, that interview. And what the AI overview from Google spit out, John Biewen is a board member for NC Local, which is absolutely false.
Oh, gosh.
And then it had a photo of my former colleague, Michael Betts, who's a black man.
Yeah, 1898, your
Now,
series.
admittedly,
Yeah.
yes. Now,
Yeah.
admittedly, I know that even regular Google would do that, right? With images, where it just grabs an image from some page that they found that has your name in
like
it.
the photo of Michael was kind of like
The photo of Michael
position
came
as
up
you.
alongside John Biewen as a board member for NC Local.
Wow.
Right?
I mean, in fairness, you and Michael look.
We look.
Other than the fact that he's a large black man, you're.
Yes, and
You're
I'm a
younger
white-haired white
women.
man.
Other than that, you look exactly alike.
Other than the fact that his hair is black and mine is white, we look very similar. He has
Yeah.
glasses. I don't have glasses. He has a beard. I don't have a beard. And we could go on. But anyway, yeah. So that's. I mean, I'm sorry, that's a little too easy. Low-hanging fruit for an anti-AI Luddite. But come on. Yeah, I just. Yeah, obviously, I'm not an early adopter, to put it
I always
mildly.
point out to people that the Luddites were not against technology.
Exactly.
They
100%.
They were in favor of quality and human rights for workers. That was their beef.
Yes, and the data center and the energy, the fact that the energy of it all and all of that is absolutely figures in my take.
I used to say we need to make a Luddite podcast, but I know that there's probably 60 Luddite podcasts. So I need to go find them so we
Right.
can talk about them.
So here's my closing question. As Americans, we are like exceptionally good at nostalgia. And anytime there's a problem or a crisis, there's always this tendency and this urge to go back to the golden age and look at how they did it back then. Is there any of that for you guys, or are you strictly thinking about creating the new future, or is there some Venn diagram between those two?
I think when people look back, there's different modes people can look back with, different ways of thinking that kind of like motivate people to look back. And one is nostalgia, as you said, this idea that maybe back in the day we had everything was great, and now it's ruined. There was a golden age where our local news was wonderful, and now that's all been messed up by whatever the forces are, including things like, market and capitalism. We're not in that tradition at all. There's another critical tradition of looking back at history that, one, tries to simply say, how did we actually get here? Right? What were the forces that actually brought us here? And part of the reason of doing that is not to necessarily say, like, you might in that process, often you will find that there are moments or aspects of our reality that were better, places where people had figured something out. And the reason why you lift those things up is not to be nostalgic, but to say it didn't have to be this way, and it doesn't have to be this way going forward.
Well, John Biewen, Dr. Chenjerai Kumanyika, thank you guys both so much for your time today. We really appreciated it.
Really appreciate your careful ears and your interest in this work. Love it.
And I want to say on a personal note, we really did enjoy this podcast. You guys were a great team, and I think it kept it dynamic. It kept it on its feet. It kept you engaged in the conversation instead of just being sort of washed over with facts and figures.
And we're hoping a lot of journalists listen to it because you're seeing us and what we have to go through. And thank you.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that.
So
yeah,
much.
that's meant a lot, actually, the response from journalists and media experts and people who really know the field. That's been gratifying to see
Yes, thank you so
the response
much.
to it.
And respect to y'all for the work you're doing, man. Keep going.
Really,
Oh,
for real.
geez.
All right. Well, that's it for this edition of The Newsroom. Thanks to my colleague Rachel Keith and our guests for this show, John Biewen and Dr. Chenjerai Kumanyika. And, as always, to WHQR Program Director Ken Campbell for technical support. Music for today's show was provided by If These Trees Could Talk and Blue Dot Sessions. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or an idea for a future show, email us at newsroom@whqr.org. I'm Ben Schachtman. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us for the next edition of The Newsroom.